The snow didn't just fall in Pine Hollow that winter. It devoured. It crept up porches, wrapped itself around trees, and blanketed the roofs until the entire town seemed trapped under its icy grip. The locals were used to harsh winters, but this one felt different. The air carried an edge, a stillness that made every creak of a wooden floorboard echo louder than it should. At first, nobody paid much attention to the eerie whispers. They brushed them off as the wind weaving through the mountains, a perfectly normal sound in a place like Pine Hollow. But then the children started hearing them too. "They're calling me," said little Maggie Carter one morning as she poked at her cereal with a spoon. Her mother, Sarah, smiled dismissively. "Calling you? Sweetheart, it's probably a dream. The wind can sound strange this time of year." Maggie shook her head, her tiny face pinched with confusion. "No, Mama. They said, 'Remember us.'" Sarah froze for just a second, barely long enough for Maggie to notice, then laughed it off. But deep down, Sarah couldn't help but feel a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. By the end of the week, Maggie wasn't the only child hearing voices. Parents began whispering to each other at the grocery store, at church, and in the town square. Some claimed their kids spoke of glowing eyes in the woods. Others said they'd caught glimpses of shadows moving against the white snow, too dark and solid to be tricks of the light. The whispers weren't confined to the children for long. Soon everyone heard them. On the 7th night, Mark Rivers, Pine Hollow's sole mechanic, sat on his porch with a steaming mug of coffee, staring out at the dense woods that bordered the town. Mark wasn't the type to scare easily, but even he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It started as a soft sound, barely audible over the rustle of tree branches. "Remember us?" Mark squinted into the darkness. "Who's out there?" he called, his voice rough. The whisper came again, louder this time, and carried on the wind like a lament. "Remember us." Mark bolted inside, slamming the door behind him. The next morning he told everyone who'd listen about the voice, but most shrugged it off. Those who didn't shrugged for a different reason, because they'd heard it too. The fear in Pine Hollow grew. By the second week, strange symbols began appearing. Frost etched intricate rune-like markings on windows, car windshields, even on the side of the church. Nobody could make sense of them. Father O'Malley, the town's aging priest, examined the symbols with a furrowed brow. "They're not from any scripture I've read," he said, shaking his head, "but they feel ancient, powerful." "Come on, Father," interrupted Mayor Harold Quinn, who stood nearby with his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "It's probably kids pulling a prank. Maybe it's graffiti or, I don't know, something the snow does." Father O'Malley gave Harold a long, measured look. "Snow doesn't write warnings, Harold." The turning point came 3 nights later. At exactly midnight, the town shook with a sound that could only be described as otherworldly. It wasn't a scream, but it carried a sharpness that made people cover their ears. Windows rattled, doors swung open, and the lights flickered in every home. The next morning, a new development made leaving impossible. Fog had rolled into Pine Hollow thick and unnatural, choking every road leading out of town. "We're trapped," said John Carter, Maggie's father, pacing in the town square. "Something's keeping us here." The townsfolk began to panic. Harold Quinn tried to calm them with empty promises, but no one believed him anymore. That night, the figures appeared. They stood at the edge of the forest, dozens of them, silent and unmoving. Their shapes were faint but unmistakable, their eyes glowing a pale blue. The townspeople locked their doors, peering out from behind curtains as the figures drew closer. Wherever they walked, frost followed. Plants wilted, ice crept up walls, and the air itself seemed to freeze. Desperate for answers, the townsfolk turned to Abigail Moore, the elderly librarian who had spent her life in Pine Hollow. Abigail was a living repository of the town's history, and she knew more about its past than anyone else. When the mayor and a small group of frightened residents arrived at her home, Abigail was waiting for them, wrapped in a heavy shawl and sitting by the fire. "I've been expecting you," she said simply. "What's going on, Abigail?" Harold asked, his voice trembling. "What are those things?" Abigail stared into the flames, her expression unreadable. "They're the forgotten walkers," she said at last. "The what?" "Long ago, before this town was called Pine Hollow, it was a mining settlement," Abigail began. "One winter, a group of miners was trapped in the mountains during a brutal snowstorm. The townsfolk promised to send help, but the weather worsened, and the miners were left to die." Harold shook his head. "That was centuries ago. It can't have anything to do." The room fell silent as Abigail's words lingered in the air. Even the crackling of the fire seemed to hush, as if the flames themselves were listening. "You mean to tell us," Harold finally said, his voice strained, "that these things are ghosts? Spirits of dead miners?" Abigail turned her sharp, knowing eyes on him. "Not just spirits. They are a memory, Harold. A memory of betrayal, pain, and loss so strong it's carved into the very bones of this land. You think time erases everything? It doesn't, not when the truth is ignored for so long." "What do they want?" asked Sarah Carter, who had joined the group despite John's protests. She was clutching a photo of Maggie, who was asleep back home, blissfully unaware of the gathering. "Why now?" Abigail sighed, the weight of her years pressing visibly onto her frail frame. "They want to be remembered, to be acknowledged. Their pain has been buried under generations of snow, but the land remembers, and now so do they." The mayor shook his head vehemently. "This is absurd. We're in the 21st century. Ghost stories don't trap people in towns or bring fog that blocks every road out. There has to be a logical explanation." Abigail gave him a long, hard look. "Then by all means, Harold, go and find your logic in the woods tonight, alone." The mayor opened his mouth to reply, but stopped. His face drained of color, and he fell silent. By morning, it was clear that something had to be done. The walkers hadn't moved closer overnight, but they remained at the edge of the woods, their glowing eyes a haunting reminder of the danger that lurked just beyond the town's borders. Abigail called a meeting in the church. Nearly the entire town showed up, their faces pale and drawn. Even Father O'Malley, who usually led with a comforting presence, looked uneasy as he stepped aside to let Abigail take the pulpit. "This isn't just about survival," Abigail began, her voice steady despite her frailty. "This is about redemption. The walkers aren't here to destroy us. They're here to make us face the truth. They want us to remember their story and to honor it." "How do we do that?" a man in the back called out. "We can't change what happened to them." "No," Abigail agreed, "but we can ensure their story is told. We can acknowledge their suffering and make amends for the sins of our ancestors. It starts with a memorial, a proper tribute to the miners who were abandoned, and it ends with us promising never to let such a betrayal happen again." Murmurs spread through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, while others looked skeptical. Harold Quinn stood up, his expression grim. "And if that doesn't work?" he asked. Abigail didn't flinch. "Then we'll face the consequences. But at least we'll have tried." That night, a small group ventured into the woods. Abigail led the way, her lantern casting eerie shadows on the frost-covered trees. Father O'Malley walked beside her, clutching a worn Bible. Behind them were Sarah, Harold, and Mark Rivers, who had reluctantly agreed to join after his own encounter with the voices. As they approached the clearing where the walkers stood, the air grew colder. The figures turned their glowing eyes toward the group, but they didn't move. Abigail stepped forward, her breath forming clouds in the freezing air. "We know who you are," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "You were the miners abandoned by this town centuries ago. We've lived too long without acknowledging your pain, and for that, we are sorry." The walkers didn't respond, but the frost beneath Abigail's feet seemed to pulse, as if the ground itself was listening. "We've built a memorial," Abigail continued. "It bears your names. Your story will not be forgotten." Father O'Malley stepped forward, holding up his Bible. "Rest now," he said softly. "Find peace in the knowledge that your suffering has not been in vain." For a moment, nothing happened. The walkers stood silent and unmoving, their glowing eyes fixed on the group. Then, slowly, one of them stepped forward. It was a man, his face gaunt and hollow, his eyes filled with a sorrow that seemed to stretch across time. He raised a hand and pointed at Abigail. The wind picked up, carrying a whisper that was unmistakable. "Remember us." "We will," Abigail promised, tears streaming down her face. "I swear to you, we will." By dawn, the fog that had choked Pine Hollow was gone. The roads were clear, and the sun shone brightly for the first time in weeks. The walkers had disappeared, leaving behind no trace of their presence except for the frost-etched symbols that slowly faded as the day grew warmer. The townsfolk gathered at the new memorial in the square, their breath visible in the cold morning air. Abigail read the names of the miners aloud, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. When she finished, there was silence. Then one by one, the townspeople lit candles and placed them at the base of the memorial. Over the next few months, Pine Hollow changed. People who had once been distant neighbors became close friends. The community came together in ways it never had before, united by the shared experience of facing the walkers. The story of the forgotten walkers became a part of the town's identity. Abigail's book, The Whispers of Pine Hollow, was published and widely read, ensuring that the miners' story would be remembered for generations to come.